He's here to reminisce with some of familiar territory. Dr. Keppie has a Bachelor's of Science in Conservation and Biology from UW-Stevens Point, an MS in Wildlife Ecology and Statistics from Oregon State University, and a PhD in Zoology from the University of Alberta. He has held teaching and research positions at the University of New Brunswick for 39 years, teaching ecology, evolution, ornithology, wildlife habitat, and research in science philosophy. He conducted research on population dynamics of northern grouse, American woodcock, and small mammals. And he has a particular interest on whether and how we can apply concepts from science to our management objectives with wildlife. He's here today to talk about some early history at the Paul J. Olson Wildlife Area and some contemporary ideas about grouse. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Dan Keppie.
Well, I'm going to do this totally without notes, so we'll see what I can remember. First, there was a question about how either Leopold or the others at that time got their numbers and an estimate of the numbers of birds or of deer. And I think the answer is that in those days, both Leopold and Gross, who was the other author on the 1930 report, both of those authors used what they called observers. They don't define who the observers were, not at all. But certainly that was the time at which mail carriers began to be used as observers, counting the number of times they saw a deer cross the road or some such thing. So it's a bunch of people coming together, providing some numbers, and that being used by Leopold or others. Well, to back off and to start, Kurt used about half of what I was going to talk about. And I have been influenced by the same sorts of written things. I read Sand County in 1962. I read Silent Spring in 1962. Both of those have influenced me heavily. I had a good time at Stevens Point. I used game management as a textbook, and that's partly because maybe Weevil was not too modern at that time. But nevertheless, those things that Leopold wrote certainly are long-standing things. Better than modern day materials, I think. Well, I do want to say something about hammerstrums, for sure, but we had a very good introduction. Both of them, so I'll just condense it to one main topic, and that is their writings. Both of them were very good writers in different sorts of ways. Fred in his research and science way, and the care he would take. And then Franz in everything else about everyday life and nature and so forth. Now at breakfast time today, I said a few words about Franz, and I forget what I said, but it had to be about her, I recall. Now, there's one thing of interest, and, well, there's actually two things. One is the way she wrote, and particularly the book called My Double Life, which is actually a book it's actually two books. The first half being her upbringing, so that part was new to the world. But the second part is from another book, strictly for the chickens. So you've got the two parts of her life together under one cover. The other thing that strikes me relevant, and Kurt certainly introduced this when he spoke about the heath hen. Gross, who did a 1930 publication on prairie chickens, the Prairie Chicken Investigation, I don't know if he was actually requested to do the work by the state, but he had experience. And that experience was a monograph that he wrote in 1928 about the heath hen. And the heath hen was becoming lost at that time. Well, in 1916 there was a major fire on Martha's Vineyard. And there were, Franz says, and I've heard other numbers, a couple of thousand birds were alive before the fire. The next year there were only, supposedly, a couple hundred. Supposedly as a result of the fire. The fire was in spring. I think it was an April fire. 1928, that number was down to about 1 to 200. 1931, it was, 1928, do I have my numbers wrong? 1928, it was, oh yes, okay, now I have it. 1928 was a couple hundred birds. 1930, it was down to 4. 1932 or 33, I do not recall which, was the last year a single male was seen. The reason I bring it up is twofold. One, Fran writes in My Double Life that she was playing tennis at the time with lots of other youngsters, and the man in the truck who came to get help from the children did not get that help to fight the fire. They stayed playing tennis. That inability apparently struck her. She writes about it in My Double Life. It's a short chapter, just a page or two. And she then says, maybe that had something to do with me wanting to go west and try new things, and to devote her life to the bird here. The other reason I think it's worth bringing up is that it's possible for a bird very abundant to go down. Now, we've seen that with passenger pigeons, for sure. But heath hens are related to our birds here, for sure. And it's entirely possible that something could happen in the west of Stevens Point region that would take these 1 to 200 birds down to a very, very low level. Now, Fran was apparently struck by that incident of not helping someone who who came to ask the children for help. And it strikes me as being somewhat similar as the degree to which we would offer our personal help. Maybe not just to a fire, but to something else. And that it's entirely possible for low numbers to go down to zero at some point in time. The Heath Hen had a fire that took numbers way down. It happened to coincide, a couple of years after that, with a major goshawk intrusion. Chicken hawks, sometimes the word is. So, things can happen. They apparently influenced Fran and Fred, I suspect, and I wonder if they affect our willingness to help, to do things. Well, moving on, and I don't think I will talk much about grasslands, really, other than to remind us that all grass is not necessarily the best of grass. The species are different. Some seem to be better for food. Some species seem to be better for structure and holding uprightness in winter, for shelter, and consequently, as Hammerstrom wrote, or Hammerströms wrote, it appears that the bird needs a mixture of grasses that probably will require more space than if they only needed or used a single kind of place. Now, we were introduced to the idea of grasslands for the species and the kinds of activities that are needed to keep those grasses working for the bird. But one other thing was in that 1957 booklet by the Hammerströms and Matson, and I have a copy, oh maybe I don't. I do have a copy, it's in the hotel room, I guess. One other point that Hammerström was quite clear about in 1957, and that is that the bird needs space. But I asked you, just what is space? That's not something you or we, managers, researchers, can go out and measure. They can't grab it. It's not like a handful of corn. So he introduced space as something that the bird requires, but really failed to tell us how to do things with it or for it. Yes, the bird appears to use spatial places. And it appears that one of the things that is, in my view, not good in the Olson area, and that is that space off of the Olson area appears to be, how do I say, it appears that off of the Olson area there's an increase in the number of houses, retention of barns, new barns, and as well the amount of planted trees. Now when I came back here and just found myself flabbergasted at the area. I don't recognize it from the mid-1960s. After all, you've got street signs, street names. The roads are named even. and they're asphalt. So, could we have the one slide? I'm just showing two slides today. Now, this may not show up well at all, but that was me back in about 1964. And I made that blind, and I had directions from Fred and Ray Anderson, and so that's what I made, and I made a couple of them. They're 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, and that's my car. And that is what's the name of the old Koch View ground band, Lundberg Road?
Lundberg, yep.
How?
How's that Lundberg Road?
Lundberg?
Yep.
Okay, whatever it was. That place. So this is me driving around, and I was counting birds. I was trapping in winter. That's not winter time either. That's Easter. I don't know if it was 63, 64, somewhere in there. So that was me, if you happen to be here and remember it. That's okay. Well, if we leave mostly grassland stuff out of the way momentarily, despite its importance, but if we count birds, then we have a topic that I'm particularly enthused about because I happen to be quite critical on counting things. The numbers of prairie chickens in this region have gone up and down. And that seems to be the case everywhere that there are prairie chickens. And there are times at which some author has implied that the birds are cyclic. And cycles do occur, particularly in certain species, snowshoe hares, lynx, ruffed grouse, etc. Maybe prairie chickens at least used to be cyclic. For example, they would go up and hit a high point about every 9th or 10th or 11th year, go down again, then up again, then down again. 10-year cycle. And we do find that both on Buena Vista Marsh and here, the highest numbers that have been reported, I think I'm correct on this, were in 1951, 1981, etc., with low points in between. Now, the low points were when I was doing the counting. Okay, I won't say much more about that. And what does bother me, though, and the high point was about 300 males on legs in this Olson area. 300 is what? 8 or 9 times the numbers that I was observing in the mid-60s. The mid-60s were low numbers. What does bother me, certainly, is that the last several years there have been counts of males on leks. There have been counts that are not much better than were occurring in the mid-60s. And yet we have the Paul Olson area. So either the numbers are wrong, or the the mathematical thinking is wrong, or something seems troubling. What is happening on the managed land is a question we should be asking. Now, I'll name a couple of things about problems. And one of the problems is indeed the numbers of birds. I think every author that has done some work with prairie chickens or sharp-tails or some others, every one of them has said that, or has written that the counts are probably weak and probably not accurate. And we say that because we do know males go from one ground to another. We do know that females visit different booming grounds. And we do not know how many males find females off of the lek and maybe even mate off of the lek. Nobody has answered those things. No one has actually begun to try to answer. So it becomes difficult to incorporate some sort of management plan, I would think. Maybe we will hear better on that. But it becomes difficult to incorporate management policy even if your measurement, the ways that you measure things are not known to be either good or useful, or somehow you do not know the magnitude of error. Now, that doesn't just pertain to prairie chickens. It pertains to all of the species that use these leks. And indeed, if you or I think that things are tough here, we should become aware of the literature, the newspapers, the legislation, all that is going on the lesser prairie chicken or the sage grouse out west. Both of those are in far greater difficulties than they seem to be here, at least seem to me to be in more trouble out there. Now, it's often suggested that management should use science. And I will try to not make this boring, and I'll make it straightforward and I think pretty clean. Because it is about science and management. My major point, one last point, is on a slide. So can we have a look? Maybe it could be pulled back a bit to enlarge it. Now, I'll speak it out. I did not dream this up. It was someone who had a far better imagination than me. This comes from a 1994 paper coming from some 1960s work. It's a triangle about research and management. And what I'm going to try to do here is to show that those two things are almost quite separate, unfortunately. And I'll comment more about that. if I or one of you or some student does some research, let's say on prairie chickens, that research has 3 characteristics. Generality. How general are the answers? Will those answers occur over there and back there? Accuracy. How accurate are our counts? Are they real, or is there a certain amount of error? And then precision, being the detail by which the work occurs. And if you happen to know some people doing genetic stuff with DNA, my gosh, their methods section is that long, whereas ours, it's that long, and we say we go out and we count birds, and that's about the end of the paragraph. So everything is in there. I don't know of anything else about research that is not in there. I say only 3 things. Now, the problem being, science tends to emphasize precision. And unfortunately, maybe the word statistics gets used a lot. A lot of detail is better, science tends to think. Managers, I'm going to go out on the limb. There are managers here that probably or might argue with me. Fine. I never said I'm right. You know, I may take a stance, but managers by and large want general answers. Do the managers here, or that you know, do they want high precision, high detail answers? Do the farmers want to know all of the detail in something or another? Probably not. Forest management, Canadian forest management at least, is over here. There's a stack of science this high that is little used. Science is over there. There's a stack of forest research that isn't used at all. My point is, and the author who wrote this, the point is that we must get those 2 groups together. At the start, someone needs to be on the committee to push for this and this. That has not been the case where I am from. I think in the States you do better. Until this is resolved, we won't answer really how we can save those birds. Now, to end, my criticisms, my viewpoints might not be right. The criticisms, I think, though, are true, but they pale. They pale entirely against the need for what I would term social education. I think we know enough about prairie chickens that adaptive management can be used, and maybe we'll get that defined soon. So I think we know enough to start to do better. But all of the criticisms and the need, what science has produced, are really the details. The effort, as Kurt was saying, needs to be put in the discussions and the work to try to support the views about the value of species in our lives as well as their own lives. And fortunately, what we need is to have local communities, as we see here, active and working with the various types of people that are employed in doing things. And it's only with the support of local communities that we will solve some of these difficulties. We may not solve the prairie chicken everywhere, but we can sure try. Thank you. I certainly thank the organizing committee for allowing me to return. Thank you.
I think we'll let our next speaker speak, and then maybe together you can answer questions, because this is about management. And I think it would be excellent for us to introduce our next speaker.